Good morning, everyone. We are the Group 2 of Section 10. And today, we will tackle about the political development in Rizal's context of the 19th century in the Philippines. We will discuss the development or changes on the political structure and culture in the Philippines during the Spanish regime. Next. So here are the members of the Group 2, Balete, Echon, Ibnosali, Lineses, Maligaya, Malyari, Mendoza, Pascual, Tunay, and Yapi. Next. The economic and political progress in Europe did start to hit Spain, and therefore the Philippines as well. The inevitable reduction of the galleon to Acapulco's monopoly filled in as a huge trade energizer. Manila was available to outdoor dealers by the mid-1830s, which resulted to an increased demand for Filipino products that are requested by the Europe. The start of agricultural production brought forth an advanced social course. While the economy was rising, this led to political consequences. As a result of modernization, the economy prospered. However, the colonial policies of Spain were viewed as positive hindrances to the country's further progress. Next.
How the Spaniards led to the Philippines during the 19th century. At the dawn of the 19th century, the Spanish Inquisition in the Philippines slowly crumbled. By then, they have been struggling to maintain their influence over the Philippines, with their corruption and incompetency in but the beginning of the Philippine Revolution gave rise to the unrest in the Filipino people, leading to distrust in the Spaniards and in turn spilled the guts of the Spanish administration. And on account of that, the Americans saw an opportunity to swoop in and become the final force in driving the Spanish authority out of the Philippines. Next.
There are different issues during the 19th century in terms of political development. The first one is the issue in Spanish government or the bureaucracy. The second one is the issue in fairs. The third one is the issue in Guardia Civil. Next. Spanish government bureaucracy. Spaniards threatening the Filipino inferior to them. The Spanish does not acknowledge the Philippines as the same level with Spain, as it is just a colony of Spain. They are threatening Filipino are inferior to them. Next. Human rights denied to the Filipinos. One of the things that the Spanish government denied to the natives are the human rights. No Filipinos can enjoy human rights that is according to the Spanish Constitution of 1812, even though the Philippines is under the Spanish government. Filipinos a limited involvement in government. During the Spanish bureaucracy, the Filipino have always regarded the Filipinos as an inferior to them. Meanwhile, the Spanish people held many positions in the bureaucracy. The Filipino were denied the opportunity to work in a certain position within the government. Next. Forced labor to the native Indios Sangley Polo. Filipino males between the age of 16 and 60 were forced to work in the construction of establishments such as schools, churches, hospitals, as well as roads, ships, bridges, and other public works by Spanish colonial authority. The last one is fairs privilege over the haciendas. During the 19th century, the Spanish fairs of various religious order were the wealthiest landowners in the Philippines, as they held the best haciendas or the agricultural establishments. Next.
In the 19th century, Spain's political instability as a result of civil war had a severe impact on the Philippines since it resulted in the frequent recurring alterations in colonial policy and recurrent breakdown of colonial officials. As a result, the Spanish government made it a habit to replace governor generals in the Philippines. Since the beginning of time, the Governor General has been replaced on a constant basis. There are 41 governors throughout the 45-year period from 1853 to 1898. And because the number of governors changed regularly over the course of many months or weeks, there would be no consistent policies. Failure to fulfill activities and duties has occurred from inconsistency in policy formulation and execution. Furthermore, policies will change often, causing harm to the general public. The Philippines experience political instability as a result of changing policies and governments. Next.
For the third issue, some governor generals are brutal and abusive of their power. The political instability of Spain made the Philippines as a dumping ground for bureaucrats who were simply loyal to the kings but had no idea why they were sent there. Next. Here are the following generals who are brutal and abusive of their power. First is General Rafael de Izquierdo, a boastful and ruthless governor general who ordered the execution of Gomburza. Second, Admiral Jose Malcampo, who was a good Moro fighter but was an inept and weak administrator. Next. Third is General Fernando Primo de Rivera, who enriched himself for two administrations by collecting bribes from Manila gambling casinos that he scandalously allowed to operate. Fourth is General Valeriano Weyler, a harsh and dishonest Governor General of Hispanic German origin arrived in Manila, impoverished and returned rich to Spain. And lastly is General Camilo de Polavieja, an enabled militarist but heartless Governor General and was widely detested by the Filipino people for executing Dr. Jose Rizal. Next. Fourth, there has been a failure on the part of the Spanish government to meet the basic needs of Filipinos. Due to corruption and graft in the Spanish administration, as well as a lack of Filipino involvement in government, basic needs such as public works, schools, peace and order, and other essentials of existence are not met. Next.
The issues in friars. The use of religion to abuse power. Due to the scarcity of Spanish officials in the Philippines, the friars were the only Spaniards in towns, effectively making them in charge, in which the Filipino people adhered to and followed their rules. Although friars' involvement in the country's political development has had a positive effect, it has been overshadowed by their negative impact. Abuse, mistreatment, and corruption were prevalent due to the friars' position of religious knowledge and power. Rizal also expressed his desire to strike the friars in a letter to Blumentritt, citing how they exploited the town's residents with religion, which Rizal also added was wrong because God should not be used as a shield of abuse. Next slide, please. The, frail, the Phreelocracy. During the 19th century, friars became more influential and powerful because of phreelocracy, or the rule of friars. The friars wanted reforms, offering to collaborate with Filipinos in Spain to make a change. This movement, however, failed because of the problems that arose. Modernization of the Philippines was the aim of all liberals and nationalists. Phreelocracy is coined by Marcelo H. del Pilar, and it is one of the most brutal cases during the 19th century. Next.
There are three issues under the Guardia Civil. First is the oppression and discrimination towards native or Indios. Second is failure to protect the people in the country. And third is the failure to maintain peace and order. Next. The Guardia Civil is a Spanish national police force formed along military lines that is primarily responsible for preserving order in rural regions as well as monitoring borders and highways. They evolved into an oppressive force harassing farmers in the provinces and exploiting their position for personal gain. Also, later they became notorious for abusing innocent people, plundering farmers, carabaos, chickens, and valuables, and raping women. Next. Due to the Guardia Civil's oppression and discrimination towards the Indios, they failed to protect the people as well as maintaining peace and order as they always harass and abuse the Filipinos. Next.
Filipinos respond to the following issues in political development during the 19th century. Filipinos responded by making a way to fight for their country's independence. They began to take shape for their nationalism by political movement known as propaganda movement. Jose Rizal and our movement, which leads by our national heroes like Andres Bonifacio, who leads a revolutionary group known as Katipunan. The Filipinos did things differently. They declared that enough was enough and continued to question why corruption is pervasive, why revenues are not fully utilized, and why there is such a limited level of participation in government. Next, please.
Moving on to the five forces during the revolution. Reformist. By the 1880s, the three Filipino reformists had been joined in their quest for reform by some of the survivors of the first generation of reformists, including Lopez Gina, Jose Rizal, and journalist Marcelo del Pilar. They utilized Spain to have open conversation about the Filipinos' problems, one of which is that they have difficulty reforming because they regard Spain to be their mother tongue. The reformist steps include administering, advocating, expulsion, and awakening through creating something new. And this reform movement was known as the propaganda movement. However, the movement is not completely successful. Problems have arisen because of group divisions or people being divided, as well as selfish ambitions for themselves rather than for the country. This concept became a huge contribution in terms of political development. It is where people or a person who advocates to reform, trying to improve a system or a law. Also, it is a type of movement that aims to bring social or political system closer to the community's ideal.
So for liberals or liberalists, where the Western philosophy is in the Europe, the cradle of liberalism has become a battleground for intellectuals, students, and politicians. And it is the most divisive ideology in recent history. The ideas of liberal for Rizal are powerful and compelling, and they will affect many Filipinos' conscience. In his poem to the Filipino youth, Rizal encouraged the Filipino youth of his time to cultivate their abilities and pursue careers in the arts and science. Since the Philippines has limited access in the education, the Spanish authorities discouraged indigenous from pursuing formal education out of fear that they would use their knowledge to undermine the status quo.
And for the modernist, in the Philippines, much of the country was still steeped in feudalism. As it's today, local perception was interpreted through a romantic and traditional mentality. Nonetheless, the fundamental difficulties underpinning the transition from classicism to modernism was not addressed. There was a lack of understanding of art as an ongoing struggle with artistic and intellectual or ideological difficulties. When we are talking about political development and modernism, both of them are highly relevant. Moreover, it is a global movement in a society and culture to seek new changes in terms of industrial life, which will become an advantage not only for the governance of the people, but also for the country's development. Next, please.
So for the anti-clerical, the colonialism of Spain in the Philippines was firstly defended in the late 19th century by the Roman Catholic religion. The extreme emotionalism that characterizes the writings and documents surrounding the reformers' life and beliefs. Sword of Rizal's writings lies out the Philippine Catholic Church through novels, articles, satires, and essays, attempting to cut away what he considered as useless and condemning inside the spiritual body. Rizal and his writings were either verified or lauded. Objectivity, defined by both emotionalism and reason judgment, was unknown.
Finally, the fifth force of the revolution, the nationalists. The church dominated the colony's limited academic education, but by the 1880s, many rich sons were being sent to Europe to study. Nationalism and a thirst for reform thrived in the liberal environment. When nationalism rather was first developed and promoted, some objective realities were suppressed or overlooked. This feeling stemmed from the archipelago's political, religious, social, and intellectual ideas of itself as inextricably linked to the rest of the Spanish Empire's inhabitants. The essential concept of nationalism was oneness with an affinity to a universal and imperial Spanish society. The inhabitants of the Philippines, according to this viewpoint, were the same as the empire's other people in Spain, America, and other areas of the globe. Next.
And that ends our presentation about the political development in Rizal's context of the 19th century in the Philippines. Thank you for listening.